I was reflecting on the sessions this morning, and to be honest with you, feeling a bit jealous as a Singaporean that Thailand managed to bring the first Singularity Summit to Southeast Asia. Arguably, we were busy hosting a summit of different nature last week in Singapore with President Trump and Chairman Kim. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to try and unpack the word everything as a service through three lenses. One, from the lens of how big this shift is. Two, what are some of the drivers from both supply and demand side that are catalyzing this shift? And thirdly, reflection some of the businesses that have transitioned to play a bigger role in this space. What are some of the learnings that we can take away from those businesses? But as we go a bit further, I think it's important to look at this topic from the lens of some of the other big shifts that are happening across in our region in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to talk through 9 of these to begin with before double-clicking on the whole service economy and everything as a service. Amin spoke a bit about the rising income inequality. If you look around the world, there are 8 people that own 50% of world's total wealth. So clearly there is a bit of a challenge out there, especially when you look at the Gini coefficient numbers across in Southeast Asia. Secondly, if you look at the amount of time people are spending at work, and you compare that to the OECD averages, we are talking about 2 to 2.5 times those numbers in ASEAN. And this excludes the amount of time people spend in traffic. So naturally what that means is the amount of attention businesses need to have of their clients is going to become more and more challenging, especially as you think about the implications of a time-constrained workforce across ASEAN. Number 3, on the surface, clearly we look at a region that's blessed with demographic dividends. But when you unpack it to specific markets, including here or Singapore, you're talking about 25 to 40% of the population that's going to be 50 plus in the next decade or two. So clearly that poses an interesting question for businesses in terms of building businesses for people with money now or building businesses for people that are expected to have money in the near future. The whole trend around growing migration has got 2 forms to it. One, clearly the rise of the megacities, especially given the economic prosperity and the job opportunities it has. But also on the back of the silver economy, you're starting to see a lot of cross-border migration as people are getting priced out of cities to live in cities which can afford them and they can afford. Number 5, when you look at the youth unemployment data across the region, depending on which market you're looking at, typically tends to be 3 to 5 times of the total unemployment in the country. Clearly a phenomena that's on the rise, and that's leading to the rise of the gig economy. If you look at places like Singapore, 10% of the entire workforce is gig economy. If you look at the US, somewhere between 40 to 50% of the entire workforce is gig economy. Places like France and Europe, we're talking about 80 to 90% of net new jobs being a gig economy. So clearly a big issue for businesses to think about in the sense of these broader mega shifts. The disruption to legacy sectors, a lot more acute in asset-intensive sectors, especially those that are getting pressed for margins. You're starting to see a lot of different service-oriented plays kicking in the various asset-intensive industries. The rise of internet giants, the digital intensity in Southeast Asia is very unique compared to many other markets around the world. You notice players from the West as well as players from the North playing these cute games in different industries across Southeast Asia. I think the first wave of players from the North were players around Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, JD that tried to make a bold play on the back of commerce-related activities. What's happening now is you're seeing the next wave coming through with players like Toutiao, Meituan, Didi coming on the back of sharing economy and launching businesses across industries or funding businesses across industries to make a bigger play in the region. Influence of social media. I'm not going to talk about the 3 a.m. tweets that kick in every day, but more importantly, the power these platforms have in terms of building digital conglomerates that try and get client attention through multiple services, not just one service that they are famous for. And lastly, but very importantly, the rise of small businesses. If you look across ASEAN, somewhere between 40 to 60% of GDP for different markets is driven on the back of SMEs, and employment numbers from 50 to 80%. So fairly significant prominence of small businesses when you bake the unemployment issues that are starting to scale up. So when you put all that into perspective and look at it, that is it purely the service economy that has got a big play in this whole space, or it's a combination of these other big shifts that are driving the rise of service economy? From a global perspective, when you look at services, they are driving bulk of the growth globally. You have about 70% of contribution coming from services globally, and about 50% of jobs on the back of services. And when you unpack those numbers for different geographies, ASEAN numbers are close to about 50-50 in terms of GDP and jobs growth. What's interesting is when you double-click ASEAN and look at some of the numbers for different countries, clearly the developed part of ASEAN has got a significantly greater share of GDP coming from services, as well as employment numbers on the back of it. Which means if we sort of fast forward that story, the services-oriented play is going to be more and more important for our region. And that has been evident over the last 6 to 7 years. When you look at some of the data, 2/3 of growth in ASEAN has come on the back of services sector. In fact, it's 2x the growth that is coming from some of the other sectors across ASEAN. And what's really fueling that growth? It's a combination of both shifts that are happening in the B2C world as well as in the B2B world. In the B2C world, a lot of it is driven in terms of households are spending less on product ownership, but placing greater value on access and experiences. So when you look at some of the developed part of ASEAN and look at from a household balance sheet perspective, how much of that spend is going to goods vis-a-vis services, clearly there's a shift that's happening towards the services side of the story. And in developed parts, it's driven a lot more towards health, education, recreational services, vis-a-vis in emerging parts of ASEAN, it's a lot more towards basic necessities that the shift is happening. And you could argue, is this a phenomena that's driven through the lens of affordability, or is this a phenomena that's driven through the lens of the demographics that are changing across ASEAN? And clearly different answers for different geographies when you try and unpack that story on how big this shift is gearing up. If it was just purely in the B2C world, we can imagine, yes, that's a phase that's driven by client behavior as well as multiple supply side businesses coming through. But I think it's not just limited to the B2C side. It's also happening fairly significantly in the B2B side of the region. We recently analyzed S&P Asia's 50 large businesses and looked at the net PPE as a percentage of total assets, and you kind of see that curve on the decline. So a lot of businesses, clearly asset intensive, are reimagining the future of corporations and really are saying that do I really need to have all of these assets on my balance sheet, or can I rent a lot of these services for my front, middle, and back office through third parties and be an asset-light business model going forward? So clearly, we expect greater reduction in physical assets as businesses outsource and purchase services instead of investing in big physical assets. The catalysts for all of these changes are slightly distinct from a demand side vis-a-vis supply side, and governments have a big role to play in this phenomena. If you look from a demand side perspective, there are three big catalysts driving this shift. One is largely the customer mindset that's shifting from the fundamentals of ownership to access, and a lot of that being enabled with infrastructure that's allowing the lenses of microtransactions and thereby promoting asset optimization in individual households. The second big shift, that second big catalyst that's driving this in the business world is this desire for scalability and flexibility, or using a means word, adaptability, in terms of how quickly can I adapt myself to the way I need to reorient my business model. So businesses are rethinking, do I really need to have a lot of these assets in-house, or can I work through the lenses of everything as a service in terms of how I operate going forward? And lastly, but very importantly, the fundamentals of consumer desire for personalization and empowerment is driving this big shift from a demand side of the story. If we sort of flip to the other side, from a supply side perspective, it's a combination of a few things. One, how do I compete as a business beyond just differentiating on price and the technicalities of the product? Is there an opportunity for me to convert my product to a service and offer that with a better experience than how other product businesses have played out? It's the competition that's rising, especially in Southeast Asia, with the prevalence of multiple aggregation platforms, a lot more acute as the various mobility platforms diversify into multiple industries. And lastly, but very importantly, the formation of ecosystems that's allowing for collaboration, partnership, spurring innovation to say, do I really need to build all of these capabilities in-house? Can I really afford? Do I have the time to build a lot of these capabilities that are needed for me to be competitive as a business? Or can I rent some of these capabilities from third parties and partner with them to scale things up? And a lot of these supply and demand catalysts are getting fueled based on the regulatory architecture across industries that the governments are promoting. Clearly, sandboxes are in fashion across industries, where many governments and the regulators are saying we are building multiple sandboxes to support that. You could argue our sandbox a reflection of lack of policies or a way to demonstrate that we have got a great brand in terms of supporting these big shifts. But governments are clearly acknowledging that the legal environment, the regulatory environment needs to be flexible and supportive enough so that it allows in addressing the consumer demands as well as helping businesses transform to be asset-light, everything as a service play. So to address these evolving needs, not just the startups, but the big industry incumbents across the world have started to reimagine services. The product companies are starting to say, instead of delivering my products in the traditional format in which I used to, given the changes in affordability, given the changes in income inequality, and lots of other variables, how do I transform and offer product as a service? And similarly, in the world of services, how do I reimagine services to be able to deliver direct transfer of value instead of ownership? How do I allow customers to co-create services? How do I move towards outcome-based pricing? How do I do higher level of integration through the services part? And so on and so forth. And it's happening not just in the traditional services sector, but the traditional manufacturing-oriented industries as well. And the process-intensive industries, you're starting to see that shift taking scale across the world. So we recently analyzed about 135 odd companies around the world to say, well, how have they been embarking on this journey across industries? What are some of the moves they have been making to transform themselves from a product business to a service business, or being able to reimagine services as they embark on this everything as a service world? And what we realized was a lot of these moves are broken into two big parts. Part one, in terms of how do I transform the price-value equation, and part two, which was spoken about a bit earlier, in terms of how do I harness network effects. And there were 9 types of moves we saw businesses make across industries to transform themselves. I'm going to walk through some of these and highlight examples from different industries on how they have made some of these moves. The first one being shorten the value chain. A great case in point is a consumer products business that essentially said, historically, we have been transforming and building consumer products and offering them as food that's available on the shelves. What if we could offer meal as a service to different clients and shorten that value chain from an intermediary to be able to do direct business with clients and transforming the stage of value delivery so that clients, what they're looking for is solving the problem of meal rather than giving them raw ingredients as a consumer product business going forward. The second case from a slightly different industry, aligning price with use. I'm going to call out the example of insurance. If you think about the classical insurance model, it's all about pricing risks upfront and then managing that risk through series of premium payments that happen. One of the big shifts we are starting to notice for certain types of insurance is how do we transform this to be an on-demand model? How do we transform insurance to be micro nuggets so that there is greater alignment when it comes to price with use, and there's reduction in upfront barriers when it comes to aligning to usage-based pricing so that we can have greater affordability of some of these solutions. The third case in point, converged products. I'm going to call out the example of an infrastructure business we worked with, where the whole idea was to say that you're in the business of providing fundamental infrastructure to large corporations. How do you transform with usage of sensors and build data products on top of it so that large corporations and cities can use that data to do better energy management going forward? Unbundling products and services, classic case in point from the education industry. The traditional schools which used to offer 3-4 years, 2-3-4 year programs, essentially unbundling it to the lenses of microeducation services and giving what you want and nothing more than that, so that it all becomes micro in nature. When we look at the harness network effects, expanding marketplace reach, great cases in point in the world of financial services, where the narrative is shifting from making banking better, faster, cheaper, to actually doing banking, making banking invisible or for the invisible by expanding the market reach and embedding themselves into everyday lives of consumers. Unlocking adjacent assets, you see great stories out of Japan where some of the businesses have looked at teaming up with a combination of few other entities to create opportunities on the edge and build platforms on top of it. Turning products into product platform, an example that was called out earlier today of a business of Valve, the big gaming company that was called out earlier. They have done a fascinating thing in terms of essentially opening up their platforms for others to build products and services on top of it. Connecting peers, great narrative, especially when you look at businesses like IKEA in terms of how they have bought TaskRabbit to make it easier to be able to connect peers and solve for that hard job of fixing furniture in individuals' homes. Lastly, in terms of distributing product development, examples of home utensil businesses where historically kitchenware, cookware was sold as a product. Some of the businesses have said, let us reimagine that and say, what is the purpose for which they need that? It's really to cook, build new recipes, and create dishes on the back of it. So how do I distribute product development and create a service on top of it where we can crowdsource different recipes and people essentially get paid on the back of purchase of those recipes, and the cookware comes along with it. So these are just some examples of different business models that we have seen around the world of how businesses across industries are unpacking themselves and essentially transforming from being a product business to be a service business. The reality is it really requires reimagination of three big things. A, in terms of how you configure yourself, B, in terms of what you're offering, and C, the lens of experience. And there are 10 elements below these three mega areas. From the lens of experience, it's really about 4 things. A, customer engagement, B, brand, C, channel, and 4, services. Again, in the digital world, when you look at the notion of brands, you know, how many people knew a brand like Grab 6-7 years ago in Southeast Asia? When you go back 20 years ago, most of these digital brands are absolutely new to the region. So digital gives us an opportunity as businesses transform from product to a service business to rethink the whole notion of branding on the back of it. From an offering perspective, it's not just about building products better, faster, cheaper, but it's more about looking at how do we offer complementary services on top of it so that we can reimagine product businesses as service businesses. And lastly, from the lens of configuration, really about harnessing network effects, rethinking the whole notion of profitability, whether it's through the lens of micro or having services on top of products and charging for them. Rethinking the structures of organization, what used to be core as a product will fundamentally change in the everything as a service world to have services on top of that product and reimagining processes. What that leads to is really about sources of competitive advantage in the new world. The old world, businesses used to compete on the back of 6 key sources of competitive advantage. 1, brand. 2, talent. 3, IP. 4 scale, 5 assets, and 6 regulation. Those have been traditionally the 6 ways businesses have competed in the world historically. I think what's happening now with the rise of services economy and everything as a service, there are new sources of value that businesses are starting to compete on. And these are in 3 mega categories: category of customers, platform, and data. In customers, there was a lot of effort in terms of allowing connections being made, but I think what's happening now is the build-out of utilities so that you make it easier for build-out of entrepreneurs, and you can leverage the gig economy on the back of it. In the world of platforms, a lot of play was being made around trade, clearly acknowledging that it's not necessarily the most profitable way to build a platform story. What's happening now is platforms are evolving to co-create products and services on the back of it. And similarly, on the lenses of data, especially when you think through the lens of a time-constrained workforce, ability to get client attention is becoming a big problem, and that's why you see digital conglomerates competing not just on the back of one product or services, but launching multiple products and services to do that. Fundamentally, if you were to stay relevant and take advantage of the opportunities in this new space, it's really important to think through the 9 consumption ecosystems and 7 enabling ecosystems that are going to be very important in this space. The 9 consumption ecosystems, which we have mapped out over the last couple of years, are really around connection, F&B, mobility, physical spaces, wellness and health, payments, entertainment, learning, and communication. And we kind of unpack how the various digital native conglomerates are playing in. They're coming through the lens of attacking different consumption ecosystems by building those narratives so that they have a greater share of client attention. But historically, the traditional large incumbents have played in few of those consumption ecosystems, which is why it's really important to reimagine, is there a services lens that can be played by collaborating with multiple parties across the consumption ecosystems? This, coupled with getting greater access to value flows by being part of enabling ecosystems, is the other key element very important for incumbents to consider as they rethink the sources of competitive advantage. And these range from government. I think a bit that was touched earlier was the role the governments are going to play in the new world. If you think about the world so far, governments have played a role through the lenses of policy making, regulation, but clearly in the new world, there's going to be a greater push by governments to build digital infrastructure, as they did in the past by building out physical infrastructure. The question is, as incumbent businesses, what role we can play as the national digital infrastructures get built out across industries in that space. Similarly, when we think through the lenses of other enabling ecosystems, they're going to play a big role for businesses to be able to be part of and see some of these flows there. So long and short, I think as we try and reflect on the big opportunity that exists on the back of the everything as a service economy, it's really important for us as incumbents to reimagine products as services and reimagine services to be the next-gen services through these new sources of value beyond just competing on these 6 traditional sources that businesses have played in. These were the key things I wanted to share this afternoon. Thank you.